All right, let's take a second to talk about some misconceptions I've noticed about your understandings of America since 1975. This is going to be a really helpful video for you when you go to do your study guide in just a few minutes. And then again, when you take your test, I've kind of strategically put some information in here you're going to need. So the first thing, let's talk about that first lesson, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in that first lesson, you read about how the Soviet Union did eventually break up into smaller countries. That's why now we have Russia and not the Soviet Union. Now there's a bunch of other countries that used to be a part of the Soviet Union that are their own independent places. And it also talked about Ronald Reagan and his foreign policy. So let's talk about what made the Union so unstable. You guys did a good job of telling me that it was unstable and it broke apart, but you didn't tell me why. So this guy right here in this political cartoon, his name is Gorbachev. He's the leader of the Soviet Union toward the end of its run. And if you remember about communism, we know that during communism, everything is run and owned by the government. And typically one leader has all the power. Things have started to change by the time Gorbachev takes charge. And so what he does, and he's not very popular with the few other wealthy people in Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, is he actually creates these reforms to give people rights. Well, you know about communism. You know that if people are being given political rights, and if they're being given economic rights, that's really hard to coexist with communism. It actually doesn't work, because if the people have rights, then the government doesn't have control. And if the government doesn't have control, it's going to make them very unstable. Another thing to think about the Soviet Union is that it was very, very big. It was huge. It had taken up most of what we call the Eurasian continent, meaning that most of that big landmass is China and the Soviet Union during this time. And so it's really difficult to control an area that large. So as people started to get more and more freedoms, they started to demand change. And that's why smaller pieces started to break off. They started to form their own countries. And the last straw is what happens in Berlin with the removal of the Berlin Wall. Once the Berlin Wall falls, the United States deems that a win. It's the end of the Soviet Union. Because it was the last big symbol that something was separate. It was the last actual physical symbol that we have communism versus democracy, and they are not able to coexist. And then the difference in Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. This was also a struggle that I noticed. You guys kept saying, well, in the first term, he was really tough, and in the second one, he wanted the Cold War to end. So you did a good job of telling me that in the first term, he was very tough, but he always wanted the Cold War to end. So let's talk about that second term. After the first term, where he was very, very tough, he was trying to kind of strong arm Gorbachev into taking down things like the Berlin Wall and into the end of communism. He was a very his language was even very tough. He referred to them as the evil empire. And one thing to note about Ronald Reagan is that he was an actor before he was the president. So he really did a good job of speaking clearly and making his sorry, that was my cat, making his beliefs and his thoughts known. So his foreign policy during that first time was really tough. He was spending more money on the American military as a way to intimidate the Soviet Union. Lots of like big tough guy moves. And then during his second foreign policy, once he realizes the Soviet Union is super unstable and they're probably going to fall apart, he kind of changes his tune. Rather than being so tough and kind of continuing to label them the enemy, he actually takes a far more amiable or friendly stance, because he realizes that this giant country is about to break up into pieces. We're going to definitely want to make allies with as many of them as we can, as long as they're not building oppressive governments, so that we can have them available for trade. So make sure you know that that's really the big difference. So let's move on. September 11th, you guys did a good job explaining what happened and who was responsible. We know that on September 11th in New York City, 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center, 2 separate towers of the World Trade Center. We also know that on that same day, there was an attack on the Pentagon, which is where the United States holds all of its military bases. Like it's like the military hub for the United States, and it's just outside of Washington, D.C. So those were the 2 big events. We know that Al-Qaeda, which is a terrorist organization, took responsibility for it. Later, the man that we did kind of blame for it, or well, not kind of blame for it, the man that we held responsible, his name was Osama bin Laden. And we really need to talk about the effects of September 11th. After September 11th, you guys did a great job. You noticed that the Department of Homeland Security was created. The Patriot Act was passed. The Patriot Act was something that gave the United States government the permission to surveil the citizens. But there were a couple of things that you guys did miss. One big thing that you guys miss is the increase in security following 9/11. People used to be able to just kind of go into an airport 30 minutes before their flight and it would be fine. All of these big like security stations and TSA checkpoints that you see, that is a result of September 11th, 2001. And then, of course, you have the war on terrorism. George W. Bush declared a war on terrorism following September 11th, 2001. The United States has troops still in the Middle East fighting this war on terrorism, even if it is not technically labeled that. This is when it really started soon after, when the United States went into Iraq, not Afghanistan. Iraq is where Saddam Hussein was the leader. He was a corrupt dictator who was believed to have weapons of mass destruction. So the United States went in to try and take care of that. We also had troops in Afghanistan where the Taliban, which had been infiltrated by terrorists, was running the government in Afghanistan. So a lot of our involvement in the Middle East is a result of the effects of September 11th, though there were definitely signs that this was coming before September 11th with things like Operation Desert Storm. And finally, the digital age. One big thing that I noticed is that some of you didn't realize there's a difference between a computer and the internet. Computers function without the internet. It does a lot of things without you needing to be connected to the internet. And a lot of your responses, you kind of lumped them together. A personal computer is not what you find information on. The internet is what you find information on. Personal computer is a tool. So it gives you the ability to do things like type. It gives you the ability to use things like a calculator. It gives you the ability to store information. The internet is that web of connection where you're going to find information and where you're going to share your thoughts and ideas. Make sure you keep them separate. Not all computers, even when I was a kid, my computer did not always have the internet on it. You actually had to, once we got internet, you had to go in and you had to essentially turn it on. It was called dial-up, and then you had to wait for it to connect. It wasn't just always there. You also lose internet on your phone. When your phone does not connect to Wi-Fi, it still functions, guys. So you need to remember that the computer is the tool, the thing that you have. It does more than just what it does when it's connected to the internet. The internet is essentially your web of connectivity. This is your hub of information. So make sure when you guys are doing your study guide today, you remember these things. Some of the questions on your study guide are very specific to the things that I just talked about. So it's going to be really clear to me if you have watched it or not. Let me know if you have any questions.